So yeah, remember at the end of the last video when I said we were going to go back to the main series this time? Yeah, that was a lie, because I was stupid enough to think that going by chronology rather than release date was smart. So today we're having ourselves a nice little change of pace by going from a mini-series to a special issue. I can tell you're all excited, so let's dive into Super Sonic vs. Hyper Knuckles and see how this one goes. In terms of the cover, it's a bit, busy. While our two main characters are front and center and take up a decent amount of the front cover, the lighting, the emeralds, the two super modes in silhouette in the background make the whole thing feel really busy. The detailing is nice, but it doesn't really pull the eye in a pleasing manner. Also, both Sonic and Knuckles look like they're missing their front teeth in this pose. We open on Sally, Tails, and Sonic watching as Knuckles appears on their plot convenience monitor. For reasons unknown, he's heading towards Robotropolis. Sonic, already very wary of Knuckles from their last encounter in the Triple Trouble special, immediately suspects that he's up to no good and dashes off to confront him. Sally attempting to tell him to just talk to the echidna. Tails even guesses that they'll be fighting by page 6. You know, ordinarily I'd say that's actually a pretty funny meta joke, but at this point I just see it as an admission that the formula of these two fighting each other without much cause is already getting stale. Cut to Knuckles as he decides to monologue to himself about what brought him to Robotnik's front door, even starting us off with a nice pretentious declaration about how Echidna Society abandoned technology in favor of being environmentally friendly. Because all technology does is ruin the environment, kids. All of it. We flash back to a conversation that Knuckles had with Mighty the Armadillo, where they discussed the idea of a Chaos Emerald breaking in two, like what happened in the last special. Knuckles worries that if anything happens to the current emerald powering the island, well, he's kind of SOL. Thanks to a mystical tome, that is so mystical and important that they leave it in the trunk of a fucking tree, called the Book of Myths, which begs the question why they're consulting it if everything in there is mythical, i.e. made up. He discovers that power rings let off a type of radiation similar to the Chaos Emerald, and they might hold an alternative power source should the Chaos Emerald fail him. So Knuckles finds himself next to an important-looking grotto outside of Robotropolis. He notes that it has an old surveillance monitor looking in on it, but that it's far too old to be working anymore. Before he can examine it any further, bam! Sucker punch by Sonic. And you all know the drill by now. 4 pages of fight scene between the two of them, where neither of them makes any sort of attempt to actually talk out their differences or figure out just what the hell is going on. It does have a few highlights, like Sonic reading a letter from Sally that he's legally obligated to share about peaceful coexistence, or the two of them trading blows with a big dead tree. Sally comes along and manages to stop the two of them with a word, and while the two of them are very obviously just barely holding back their animosity, Sally points out that Nicole is detecting some weird radiation in the area, and as it turns out, conveniently, the dead tree the two of them uprooted leads deep into an unknown zone, essentially just a platforming level from an actual Sonic game. Knuckles immediately jumps in and Sally orders Sonic to get after him before things get rough, but accidentally lets it slip that she and Knuckles apparently knew each other and used to spend summers together. This revelation is so out of left field that it actually causes Sonic to bend the laws of physics to stop himself from jumping into the hole to question Sally about it, who immediately deflects and pushes him to go after Knuckles, followed by a cute panel where the both of them think about how much the other cares. Sonic and Knuckles are once again at odds and both run around the zone trying to grab as many power rings and Chaos Emeralds as they can. Sonic, being the faster of the two, manages to overtake Knuckles, grabbing 50 rings and 7 Chaos Emeralds, allowing him to transform into Super Sonic. And Knuckles grabs 4 more rings and is able to transform into Hyper Knuckles. Oh boy. And from there we get ourselves another extended fight scene. 8 pages worth of fight scene. And it's even more egregious than usual because, well, look at the page layout. Look how freaking large the panels are here. Look how much space they take up. Okay, yes, the artwork in this sequence is actually really nice, but 8 pages of this 48-page special, a majority of this particular story, is a fight scene full of padding. And then the fight ends with the zone they're in being overloaded due to the power the two of them are putting forth in their clash, and causing it to break down and explode in a sudden and unsatisfying ending to the much touted fight between these two. Also, I don't think Knuckles is making it out of this in one piece. Look at the perspective on him from here. What is happening to his middle? Cut to Robotnik, where he's informed of the zone's collapse before complaining about only being on one page out of the whole 48-page special. I'm not one to usually agree with the villain, but he's not wrong here. The entire conflict of this story centers around Sonic and Knuckles being petty assholes, and Robotnik gets the best joke of the book right here. Cut back to Sonic, who wakes up next to the lake, with Sally being there to make sure he's alright. Turns out that little grotto was actually the Lake of Rings, and the old camera there was actually a camouflaged monitoring system. Sally explains that what we just saw happened. And then she sped off to go and get Sonic. Sonic keeps trying to ask her a question, but Sally attempts to dodge around it until finally blurting that Knuckles went flying off in a different direction. She doesn't know where he is, and Sonic should just drop asking about the past. Turns out Sonic was just asking if she'd brought any chili dogs with her. Whoops. Well done, Sally. And that is the end of this wholly underwhelming story, where we once again see them promising us something awesome, but then manage to screw it up in practice. The actual story itself is pretty damn short, with most of it being taken up by the two fight scenes, and a lot of exposition on Knuckles' part to justify why he's not on the floating island. The animosity between him and Sonic in this story is pretty damn ridiculous and wholly unneeded, making them both look like thick-headed macho morons, which doesn't reflect well on either of them. Some interesting hints and details were dropped at the very least. Sally's relationship with Knuckles is the big one, of course, and while it doesn't really go anywhere, it is a detail that will be brought up in a few stories down the line. And of course, it's used as a point of animosity between Sonic and Knuckles, as if they needed more of that. Overall, however, the story is just exhausting, and nothing but an excuse to have Sonic and Knuckles fight more, and doesn't even really deliver on its promise. Yes, Sonic and Knuckles do fight in their super forms, but they do so for a stupid reason, in an inconsequential area that has no bearing on anything, and it ends in an incredibly contrived and unsatisfying manner. And I'm saying that about two beings whose power is apparently so great that their fight causes a pocket dimension to collapse in on itself. The art, however, is very good. Once again, we got Art Mawini to thank for this one, so everyone looks quite nice and on model most of the time, though admittedly there are some panels like this one where the rounded look of the classic character models looks more than a little exaggerated. And need I point out that weird perspective on Knuckles in the exploding zone? But as Robotnik pointed out in his one-page cameo, this is a 48-page special, so we've got more to cover here. There is a one-page epilogue to the first story where Knuckles returns to the island where Mighty has apparently learned the news of what happened, despite it just happening. And the news somehow made it all the way to the floating island, where Knuckles states that the trip wasn't a total loss, as he did manage to get himself a spare Chaos Emerald. And then, sudden art shift! Yes, for the remainder of this special, Mawini has unfortunately left us, and we're left with Ken Penders as the penciler here. I'll not blame the amateurish art on Harvo, who only handled the inks. He was just working with what he was given, after all. A majority of this backup story is framed as Knuckles wandering the island as he thinks about the lessons his father taught him, giving us a sense for how Knuckles was trained as a kid, though apparently a lot of the lessons of observation didn't sink in at the time, and he even criticizes himself for that very reason. And then we get a flashback of the day that Locke left his son all alone, walking to the Forbidden Zone and throwing himself into some sort of giant energy wall. Knuckles, of course, never thought to actually investigate what the hell was happening there. And boy, does that lead to some messy stuff down the line. Knuckles then thinks about the more recent events in his life, such as being tricked into working with Robotnik and forming a team with the Chaotix, an event that we'll be getting to soon. I just didn't cover it first because the first story takes place before it, but this backup story takes place after it, and you know what? Chronology is freaking fusing. We end this rambling backstory with Knuckles promising that he will find the answers he seeks, if not just for himself, then for his father and his new team of friends. This story is really freaking boring. Don't get me wrong, Knuckles' backstory, especially at the time this comic was published, was actually a pretty interesting thing to talk about. Knuckles is, as far as he knows, the last of his kind and the last in a long line of Guardians who are supposed to keep the floating island safe. He doesn't know why, he just knows that he is, and not having the answers frustrates him. This came out years before Sega would attempt any sort of meaningful insight of their own, for better or worse, and I think the concept can work, even in a kid's comic where they couldn't explore the full ramifications of Knuckles' situation. Later comics would actually offer some very interesting plotlines centered around this idea, until it became a swirling tangle of retcons and stupidity that only existed because one writer in particular really wanted to tell his own stories and decided that turning it into Knuckles fanfiction was the easiest way to do so. Was that too mean-spirited? Who the hell cares? The series is over anyway, and I don't see a reason to pull punches at this point. Getting back to this story in particular, like I said, it's boring. It's trying to zero in on an interesting premise, trying to push us towards following Knuckles on his journey of discovery, but a lot of problems plague it, the most obvious of which is the amateurish artwork, which only looks worse coming off of the comparatively excellent work Mawini gave us in the preceding story. The characters here look stiff and flat and just off all around. The close-ups look garish and warped, and it says quite a lot about Kin's skill as an artist when I think this panel, right here, the one where everything is in silhouette, is probably the most artistically competent in the entire story. But the way the story is presented here isn't that much better. As I've pointed out before, Penders has a really big problem with using dialogue as an exposition source. And so there are times when the audience is overloaded with characters doing nothing but spewing facts that the audience needs to know in order for us to understand what is going on. Even when it's not strictly necessary, Penders seems absolutely terrified of the idea of letting his story speak for itself, and instead does not let a single panel go by without Knuckles monologuing to himself about what he's doing or what he's thinking about. Consider the way this story is presented, with Knuckles musing to himself about who he is and what he's trying to accomplish and what he's looking for. Wouldn't it have been a lot more interesting if instead of conveying this all to the audience via exposition dump, we cut back and forth to him walking around the island and then having the related flashbacks based on what he sees in the present? It's not like comics can't do that, that's one of the best parts of being a visual medium. And the comic has demonstrated a few times up to this point that it does have the capacity to say a lot without a single word, a lesson that Penders didn't seem to take notes on. Once again, as setup, it's fine, but as a story in and of itself, as an examination of Knuckles at this point in time and his motivations, it fails outright because it feels the need to tell us absolutely everything. Also, it's ugly as sin too, there's that. Next time, I swear, I double-checked this time, we are actually going back to look at issue 30 of the main book. I guarantee it. Maybe. Hopefully. See you next time, everyone.